Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You may be seated. In Jewish tradition, there is a concept in our canon of the midrash. And what a midrash does is it explains something through parable or fable that makes a circumstance a little easier to understand. An example of that is many of you might have heard through our tradition that Moses had a speech difference, a speech impediment. Some say he had a stammer or a stutter. And many have heard the story that it was because of a pot of gold next to a pot of coal in which he touched the coal, it burned his hand and then his tongue and then caused him to have a speech difference. That's nowhere to be found in the Torah. That's from a midrash. Those are the things that explain to us parts of the Torah that are incongruent. And the most beautiful thing about a midrash is that you and I, all of us, have a license to interpret the Torah as we choose. All of us have a pen so that we can ask ourselves what would happen in a particular circumstance. It allows us to expound, to imagine. So, I want to offer my own form of midrash today. And the midrash is that God says to Noah, take all of the animals and put them on the ark. And you take your family and put them on the ark. And everything that doesn't go on the ark will surely die. So Noah hears the task, and he pauses for a moment, knowing that he is deputized with a godly role. Much like we say at Unatana Tokef, mi yichyeh u'mi yamut, who will live and who will die. What if there was one particular species, one particular animal that had really wreaked havoc on Earth? A particular animal that caused harm to other animals. A particular animal that caused death to humans and threatened their way of life. Would it be morally just and halachically permissible for Noah to decide, I'm not going to follow God's commandment of letting everything and everyone onto that boat. I'm going to make an executive decision at this point to not include this one animal. Because in doing so, I want the new creation that will be to be safer, to be better, to be more worry-free. What do you do when Noah makes a decision that is like that, and all of the other animals rise up in protest, saying, that's unjust, that's unfair, that's uncivilized, it's immoral, for shame? But what if those other animals were silent when that one species wreaked its havoc, attacked other animals, killed humans, threatened their way of life? Do they have a moral platform to stand on? You don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to figure out where I'm going and why I'm going there. And there is something that has me up at night this week in a different way than it did last week. And that is the instant tilt of moral judgment and condemnation that has turned against the people of Israel and Zionists worldwide. Part of that is because our society has the attention span of a tick. 7 to 9 days is the most we can tolerate of dealing with the war in Ukraine, with the terrorist attack in Israel, with flooding in the Middle East that causes 6,000 to 7,000 lives. We just don't have an attention span to sit with something long, and especially when it hurts our heart to look at. So when we look at the terror that has been wreaked in Israel and it hurts our heart, we as the Jewish people with connective tissue to the homeland of Israel, and those obviously in Israel and Zionists worldwide, it has maintained our focus. But there are many in the world where it has changed its focus. Today, there are three things that are being discussed, and I want to bring them to your attention and share with you humbly what I think we need to do. The first is about this maintenance of a humanitarian corridor and the aid that came into Gaza this morning for the first time in 2 weeks of 20 truckloads. Now, normally 450 truckloads of aid come into Gaza every day. And for 2 weeks, they have been choked out. It would all be released if they would unconditionally release those hostages. All 200, and today the count was 210. We still don't have a firm number on it. But if every hostage were released, the aid would continue to flow in. It's a pretty simple equation. But today only 20 did, and the international world is condemning Israel, even though the aid came from Egypt, that they are denying, choking, strangling, starving the innocent and good people of Gaza. I want to share a simple fact that you might not know. I learned it from David Grossman, the great novelist. 80 holes were blown in the separation wall in Gaza that allowed 2,000 to 3,000 terrorists to infiltrate into Israel. 80 holes. Now, if any of you have been to the cement wall there, it is incredibly large. They're almost as tall as the ceiling here, and they're incredibly thick. To blow them down is not an easy task. And I'm going to tell you all a little something that you probably realized, maybe didn't connect the dots with, but you knew the two dots were there. And that is, how do you think the explosives to blow apart 80 different parts of wall throughout that 25-mile strip, where do you think it came from? It came hidden in humanitarian aid and convoys that went into Israel to Gaza every day. And the Gazans complained on a regular basis about how hungry and thirsty they were and how the aid needed to come right through. And for a long time, especially during times of war, Israel had focused on pouring through and sifting through every kernel of rice to make sure that no harm was in there. And then as we let our guard down over years in quiet, enough explosive to blow 80 holes in that wall snuck through. Now, do we need to apologize to the humanitarian world for taking our time for every single kernel of rice, grain, of corn that comes through because we want to make sure there are no more guns or bullets or dynamites or RPGs within them? Isn't there a moral code on that side as well? Here's the other thing that I am starting to get very, very worried about. It happened this week in Washington, and we are going to hear about it in spades in the coming weeks and months. A group of people who were proud to represent Judaism, wearing shirts that said "Not in Our Name," donned in taluses and prayer shawls, along with others who were not of the Jewish faith, numbered in about 300 to 400 people, made a sit-in in a congressional building, not a Woolworth lunch counter sit-in, a sit-in in the building, tying their taluses to the pillars, saying, "We demand a ceasefire and we demand that Israel not go into a ground incursion in Gaza." And I was livid, because that call for peace and for the ceasefire is growing exponentially, and it will grow a lot more over the days to come. Now, if anyone thinks that I am a warmonger for what I'm about to say, I don't think you know me well. I remember standing at this very bima, delivering a sermon many years ago about the dire need for the International Red Cross to be able to visit Gilad Shalit and to check on his welfare and health, and that not doing so is an international crime. One member of the synagogue resigned in protest, referring to me in that moment as a warmonger. A few weeks later, I gave a different sermon about the need to show restraint in times of challenge. And another congregant left calling me a pacifist. It was at that moment I knew I was doing my job right. We're not going to be able to accommodate everybody. That's the nature of our world. But the idea that today, now, we should call for a ceasefire, when we haven't even come to a tally on the dead because we don't know how many there are, we haven't accounted or identified them all, there are over 200 hostages and we don't know anything about their health, well-being, welfare, and we should simply lay down our guns? There should be no sense of retaliation? The acts of Hamas should be forgiven because we are a peaceful folk? That's ridiculous. There is in Judaism a concept called a just war, a concept that reminds us that we should always seek peace. That's why the word shalom is so core to our Jewish identity and Jewish history. We are a peace-seeking people. But at the same time, there are moments in our history and in our present that demand of us to seek to blot out those who wish to do us harm. And while it seems complicated or hard to navigate, it really isn't. You see, I have a neighbor. I have no ill will with my neighbor. In fact, I care for them as a gift from God, and I look after their safety and well-being. But if my neighbor claims that they don't want me as their neighbor, and are willing to do things to me physically to challenge my physical existence as their neighbor, then you better believe that not only will I defend my homestead, but I will do everything in my power to stop them from being able to do that to me or anyone else who might be their neighbor in the future. So yes, we can be a peace-seeking group, but we're not following commandments by just having this idea of social inertia that requires us to put down our weapons. And I can assure you that what's coming in Israel is the added pall, the added fear of every Israeli knowing the worst is yet to come. When 150,000 soldiers are going to go onto the ground in Gaza and walk into buildings that are surely booby-trapped, and looking for terrorists that are disguised in blue jeans and t-shirts and look to you and me as civilians, but they might have bombs strapped to their chest or guns behind them, or they might be using other civilians as human shields, it will not be pretty. It will be messy. And there will be a high death count. And I can also tell you that the death count today is more than Israel can bear. The notion of burying one more soldier, one more, is more than we can tolerate. But it inevitably is going to happen. And that's only dealing with the Gaza side of things. But that means that just because we believe in that notion doesn't mean we are exonerated or exempt from defending our well-being. The Torah and Maimonides specifically say that when we siege a city, we can only cover it from three sides to allow one side a path to evacuate. It says that we can't destroy for the sake of destruction, that even in wartime, if there's a tree that bears fruit, we don't destroy it. We look after its welfare, reminding us that indeed we must follow an ethical standard. And I'm confident that as a whole, we will. But at the same time, following an ethical standard is not incongruent, that's a double negative, it is not incongruent with the idea of going to war. This is a moral war. This is a just war. This is a necessary war to eradicate a cancer that is our neighbor in Israel, a cancer that will attack every living organ if we don't eradicate it. And it must happen. In my understanding of Judaism, there is a certain category of rabbi that is to be revered. A rabbi who is stringent on all types of topics, really particular about rules that have to be followed, but lenient on one topic, or the opposite. A rabbi who is very lenient on all types of things, but particular on one thing. That rabbi is to be celebrated and revered. And the reason why is simple. Because that rabbi doesn't compartmentalize, doesn't say everything is good, everything is bad, this is what we stand for. That rabbi knows that in some circumstances, in some places, as he or she sees it, we have to have a different response. Not one that we necessarily pine for, but that is required. This is a moment that the Jewish community, the affiliated and unaffiliated, the Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and everything in between, must stand shoulder to shoulder with as Israel is about to go into an ugly, messy, painful, and just moral war. We cannot be divided. We can be divided on all types of other things. We can be divided on the sublime of jets and giants. We can be divided on how it is that we pray and whether women should have full rights. We can be divided as to whether our history caused this or our reality caused this. We can be divided on which direction our country should go. But we cannot be divided on standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel in this war, because it is a moral war and it is a just war. And when people are wearing shirts that say "not in our name," I want to wear a shirt that says "not in our name" for what you're doing. And it doesn't mean that I thirst blood. It doesn't mean that I look forward to this nightmare continuing for all in the region. It doesn't mean that I want innocent civilians to die. Of course I don't. But when it comes to protecting my homestead versus my neighbors who have sworn to my eradication, I know unequivocally and firmly where I am standing. And I'm standing behind Israel and its right to defend itself and its responsibility to protect its citizens by going to war to eradicate the evil of Hamas. It is, I would argue, without much of a stretch, a Jewish, halachic, moral, and ethical responsibility. And I would stretch a little further and say, it is our responsibility to support Israel in this process. Now, they have a very tricky job ahead of them. They are fighting a group that is immoral, that is unjust, that abrogates laws, and hides behind anything that will save them, including innocent humans. It doesn't mean that we are free to absolve our moral and ethical code. It doesn't mean that we can leave Geneva Conventions and international rules of law and warfare by the wayside. We cannot. We must subscribe to that because they cannot defeat us in that manner. But we must be resolute and standing shoulder to shoulder. In the coming weeks, we're going to get a lot of pushback from any media source you can imagine in the world of social media, these keyboard commandos and others that are going to call us all types of horrible things. They will. And we can and should arm ourselves with the responses. We must protect our citizenry. We must protect our right to exist. We must protect our homeland. And we must remove the cancer that is on our border. Michael Oren, former ambassador, and his sister's a member of our shul. He's spoken from this bima many a time. He was on CNN last night, and they were talking about the release of 2 hostages. And the CNN correspondent asked a good question, which is, would you agree to a ceasefire if all the hostages were released? And he said, all the hostages need to be released unconditionally. There's no question. It's a starting negotiation point without a negotiation. They just need to be released. But the idea that Hamas can walk away scot-free, unpunished, with the same resolve, raison d'etre, and fuel from their act of terrorism without reprisal would be a horrific damage. He said, who would live in a country where your neighbor has stated their intention, proven their intention, and hasn't been stopped from fulfilling that intention again? Would you live in that land? I wouldn't. I wouldn't. Not until that threat is eliminated. And we have a moral code to do so. So in my midrash, Noah has to do a moral, just, and difficult task. And it's very possible that there were a group of animals that wreaked havoc, that wreaked disaster, that were difficult to other animals and humans, that Noah decided could not get on the boat. And he might have gotten blowback for that. But it was a just decision, a moral decision, a difficult decision. It was the right decision. And if Noah asked me, I'd stand by his side in that decision. So too is this war that Israel is in and about to get deeper into. We must stand shoulder to shoulder with her right to defend herself, her right to follow morals and values and the laws of warfare, and her right to defend all of us right here too. Because the last word I will share with you that we all know is that this isn't just a war in Israel. If it were, there wouldn't be riots in Egypt. There wouldn't be people being lynched in France. There wouldn't be day schools shuttering their doors in fear of a day of rage. It's much bigger than that. They're really defending all of our right to be Jewish. So I stand with Noah in my midrash, and I stand with Israel, and I implore you to do the same. I implore you to show your Zionism, to show your pride, to use your full-throatedness, whether it's on social media, writing to the papers and the broadcast news, or even at the water cooler, and telling people Israel has a moral and just responsibility. May they do that responsibility in a way that continues to bring all of us pride and hope today and tomorrow. Amen.